Every so often in my original home church in Greenwich, Second Church, when I was scheduled to pinch hit for Bob Naylor, the pastor, my friend Bill Phillips, who was a rather high-powered attorney in town and a church member, would come to me out of courtesy. And he would say to me, "Next Sunday, I'm going to be worshiping at the Church of the Mountains." Now, in case you've never heard of that particular church, let me translate. It meant that Bill was going skiing. Or in the summer, he was going hiking. And really, there's nothing wrong with that. He also had the courtesy to let me know his plans. You see, in all of our readings today, Jesus is teaching us that, yes, it's vitally important to keep a day of rest each week, one where we can notice God's greatness and feel grateful for the good things and lessons that have come our way. That the Sabbath is meant to be flexible and to allow for our humanity. That we in every other house of worship sees that ever since the pandemic, people, and often their children, are sometimes opting for a different kind of location and activity on Saturday or Sunday. As long as it doesn't involve a total loss of that day of rest, and it involves people who care for one another, as the church does, it's okay. But remember, the Sabbath is one of God's commandments. In God's first covenant with us, God gave us 10 commandments. And God left it up to us to create laws to help deliver the truths in those commandments to people. That's where things can start to get a little bit rocky, because we're human. Since time immemorial, the people who decide that they are the keepers of the law know that this gives them a sizable slice of power and authority over other people. And that can be intoxicating and dangerous. In today's gospel, Jesus and his disciples were walking through the grain fields in the countryside. Now, it was a custom at the time, you might wonder why there was grain there. And it was a custom at the time for landowners who raised grain to always leave a little of the lesser grain up on growing in the field. Because in those days, especially a woman who was a widow and maybe had children, had no means of support, no way to feed herself and her children, other than to glean the leftover grains in the field that were left for them and for travelers, passing hungry travelers. So on this particular Sabbath day, a hungry Jesus and his disciples were plucking a few grains to sustain them on their way. Of course, the Pharisees were always nearby observing Jesus. Their upset wasn't really because he was breaking the law by plucking the grain, and that was work. They were really furious because Jesus' words gave him power with the people, because they could hear the truth and the compassion in his voice. Jesus explained that human need and compassion could override religious law. The Sabbath was made for humankind, and the humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath. And he quoted David. When Jesus reached the synagogue and entered, a man with a withered hand waited for him, and the Pharisees waited to see if he would break the law again. Of course, Jesus cured the man. And the Pharisees began to plot a way to destroy this interloping rabbi, and this rabbi who cared too much. In reality, these temple priests set up their own set of ways to get around the Sabbath laws. I love the one. They come up with some creative things. It used to be illegal for you to walk from your house to your neighbor's house. That was work. So you couldn't walk outside to your neighbor's house. So they devised a rule that it was quite okay if you took several boards and put them across to your neighbor's house, and you walked up in the air and got over to the house. That was not breaking Sabbath law. There's a way around anything. So, such foolish hypocrisy is what has driven people away from religion that day and today, from the very beginning. I believe two things have happened that have picked up the pace of people exiting their religion. The first is that word, hypocrisy. Religious organizations that hurt people, physically, mentally, spiritually, leave such gaping wounds of rejection in people's souls. It's horrible. Horrible. A study in the last decade, and it was the early part of the decade, said that 34 million Americans have given up on organized religion. That was early. It's higher now. The people are essentially spiritual. So people without the benefit of church will seek out those whose voice speak to them in an independent truth, where humans can be humans and imperfect and sometimes different and difficult. People like Henry Nouwen, the Dalai Lama, and preachers like Canadian pastor Carey Nieuwhof. All of these people are people who let it be known that God's doors are open to all. God's doors are open to all. As Carey Nieuwhof says, he gets it. He says, I completely understand why a growing number of people are bailing on church. Even people who used to lead in the church often stop attending. Well, while it's easy to point to this significant exodus after the pandemic as a temporary blip, the truth is the exit has been happening for decades, even a generation or two. And there are many explanations, he says, for why people stop going to church. The church is far from perfect. Life is complex. There are options, and the postmodern mind distrusts most things that are organized or institutional. But as trendy and as sophisticated as the idea of writing off the church might be, it's a mistake, he says. While writing off the church passes as sophisticated thinking, it's actually the opposite. Let's start with the basics. First, if you're a Christian, the church is not something you go to. It's something you are. It's something you are. You can't dissociate from the church as a Christian any more than you can dissociate from humanity as a person. You don't go to church. You are the church. You are the church. As flawed and as cantankerous as church can be, humans did not invent the church. Reading the New Testament will lead you to the conclusion that the church was God's idea. These books are about the work of church that Jesus initiated and ordained. And if you want to get rid of the church, if you really want to get rid of the church, you also need to get rid of Jesus. You can't have one without the other. The fact that Jesus started the church with imperfect people should make us marvel at God's incredible grace, that he would use you and me. So let's go back to my friend Bill Phillips and his Church of the Mountains. Sure, the mountains are great, especially when you're getting away from a high-pressure, high-people job like he has or I have. But the mountains are not enough to be anyone's church. Jeff Hoffmeyer, who's a Colorado pastor and sits right in the middle of the mountains, says that the very thing that often drives people crazy about church is what actually makes church church. And that very thing we need to encounter for the fullness of who God is. And that thing is people. People. The church is necessary, he says, so that God's people can gather and then scatter. To pray and offer each other encouragement and then go out into the world or to the mountains and then gather later again. That fellowship of being with other people is what leads to brunch and friends and sipping iced tea and looking at the Candlewood Lake. The scattering before the gathering. That brings me to the other reason that the pace of people leaving religion has picked up, and it's an insidious one. Over the last decade, we have increasingly crawled into our digital devices to the point that we don't know how to converse with anybody anymore. It's a real problem, especially for very young people who haven't had much experience. It's beyond sad for many young adults. The prospect of sitting down face to face and talking with somebody you don't know is an anxiety-producing thing if you haven't done it. Could the prospect of church actually be scary to some young adults? How many of you have been out to brunch? I know I have, and seen people sitting at the same table texting to one another instead of looking at their faces and talking. Yeah, everybody needs an escape to the mountains. However, it's one thing to visit the mountains, and it's quite another to isolate oneself and become a digital mountain hermit, so to speak. Is it any wonder that so many people feel isolated and so totally alone? So, do remember, even Jesus had brunch on his Sabbath day and when he wasn't in church. We need rest. We need also the presence of others, even as imperfect as we all may be, because we, face to face, bring hope. Hope. As Emily Dickinson says in one of her most famous poems, hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And sweetest in the gale is heard, and sore must be the storm that could have bashed the little bird that kept so many warm. I've heard it in the chillest land and on the strangest sea, yet never in extremity it asked a crumb from me. May God bless you and keep you this week. Amen.